Experience Umbria through the European Union's cohesion policy.
Yep. That's amazing that there are so lot of you. I think we already reached partially the goal to bring people from different bubbles. My name is Natalia Humenyuk. I'm a Ukrainian journalist and the CEO of the Ukrainian organization Public Journalist Lab. My co-founder and colleague Angelina Karyakina is also here. She does a bunch of the other things in her life and professionally. But we also, as a Ukrainian organization, wanted to bring our partners, really not just colleagues, but the people with whom we work, despite they coming from all over the world, and I think we also share this story, so I want to introduce Natalia Antelava, who is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of CODA and co-founder of the brilliant festival ZEG, and as well Patricia Campos de Mello, who is the legendary Brazilian reporter from Folha de São Paulo, and who've been also, reporting lots of places, and I'll start. We'll use our time wisely, and we'll keep a bit of the time for the questions as well. So we really brought this title for the panel about the polarized world, and mainly because specifically it's something our organizations works a lot since 2020. And I'll give a bit of the introduction, because we are from Ukraine. The term fake news, which at that time meant, oh, we're uncovering fake news, was not so misused. And for a couple of years, we were always speaking about debunking, disinformation, all the malign campaigns, propaganda. It was a Russian war against Ukraine already since 2014. And then we understood with the time, operating in that environment, that actually one of the biggest reasons why all the disinformation works, it's fueling the conflicts in the society, in polarizing the society. So it's like, first we need to tackle this ground, and we started to work, and we founded the organization at the moment when we wanted to work with the occupied territories, with the conflict. But at the day we founded our organization, the pandemic was announced. So we really did quite a lot of research on COVID, trustful reporting on the vaccination and things like that. But we then understood since then that polarization in journalism working in more or less every single field. So for instance, in human rights, it's working by some people just ignoring the causes they disagree. we just don't even go to the moment we want to tell the stories, because there are people saying, don't tell us about Gaza, don't tell us about Ukraine, I don't care about that, and that's okay. We understood that for anti-corruption journalists, for journalist investigators, they do investigations, but sometimes they saying that's fake because you can't get through to the audience you actually want to tell it. It works in foreign news, so if you're coming from a different country like Brazil or Colombia or Indonesia to Ukraine, there would be people saying, why are you doing this controversial story? There would be people who saying, why do you report Gaza? Why do you report this? So in a way, somehow we feel this polarization coming to more or less every part of the journalism, and we will also speak about the digital platforms, but I pass the floor to my colleague Angelina, who probably I want to share what to do with that. What are the practical ways to reach out the audiences, maybe in a bit different way, without the very common idea that you just need to do good journalism?
Thank you so much, Natalia. I think it's a $1 million question. What do we do with that? But we were able, I think, over the years just to look into ways we could engage different people who are to some extent open to discussion, because we understand people are not just closing their eyes on Ukraine reporting or Gaza reporting. They know, they are like biased, they know what the reporting should bring. So, you're covering Gaza, good, but I have already a position on that. You're covering Ukraine, great. Let's maybe, let's engage in a discussion, but I do have an opinion, and I will be, watching and reading media that reflects my opinion. And that was one of the problems. I think the opinions and the coverage and the idea that everyone has an opinion and is quite comfortable in their own bubble is amplified by social media. And, all of us journalists and editors, we think that we feel that we know what people think. We think that we know from the comments what are the moods, what are the opinions. And in fact, what we started to do is really check the reality with other people, do social polls, do focus groups, do in-depth interviews, and check whether these realities are matching. And what was really interesting to know about vaccines was the fact, when many of us, editors and journalists, were trying to tackle anti-vaccination narratives and people who are anti-vaccinators, I don't want to label anyone, people who do not support vaccines, so to say. We were quite amazed in our survey to know that many of the people do really lack just basic information about vaccines, how they work for pregnant women, how they work for elderly, for children, and maybe they would go for vaccines if they had this basic information, rather than being called, straightforward, you're a vaccinator, you're from this camp, we are from the other camp, we're not talking. And gradually it got us into new researches and new service, where we really had a task to see what people really think about topics that are polarizing. In Ukraine, many of them are polarizing. One of the first we did was actually about history. It was before we institutionalized in an organization, but we were also kind of surprised to see that people from the West and the East, which were traditionally put as opposites, had lots of topics in common, and these topics were underreported. For example, we used to have these discussions in society whether these or that historical figure is a far right or far left, is a supporter of Nazi regime or the Soviet regime, and these discussions were quite heated. But then we got to know that actually people would like to know more and share their experience about surviving the 90s, which was quite a challenging time in Ukrainian history after the fall of the Soviet Union. Or, for example, experience of the tragedy of Chernobyl. So both audiences from the East and the West having opposite opposite visions of history and who is a real historical, hero, would have the same nice or pleasant emotion about other events in the history, in the Ukrainian history. And we were asking ourselves as, media people, as journalists, why are we not covering these events? Why are we so much focused on Bandera, on Stalin, on these things, which are obviously, you cannot befriend. Befriend these audiences. They are polarizing. People have different heroes in history, and that's fine. It also led us to many other things, but which I want to be cautious of time, and we are in 2026, and we are in the middle of a brutal war in the middle of Europe. And of course, we are asking ourselves, how do we engage different audiences, global audiences, in the story of this horrible war? And of course, we did a number of projects to see how do we tell these stories in order to engage people in different parts of the world, which may be very, very far from this war and very much not care about it and also other wars. And I will go into that deeper a little bit later, but just a small outcome of this research. Of course, we started with people, with grounding reality. We did a project that is called town hall meetings. So basically, we got the war crime survivors and the law enforcement that are prosecuting and investigating these war crimes. We got them in one room just to see, what are the dynamics, what people really need to know about the war crimes, about the investigations, about justice, how they really understand justice over these 6 years. And I think the biggest lesson we learned was from them. One of the biggest lessons is that they didn't actually, they were absolutely amazing. They didn't focus on the perpetrators. They focused on their stories. They didn't talk much about the perpetrators. They talked about the way they were able to handle horrible things that happened to them. And when you tell that story as a story of in a way, I hate this word, it's overused, resilience, but it is resilient in many ways. I didn't make this up. The majority of the people that we've met who were able to talk through this tragedy, they are resilient in a way. They survived. They were able to keep on live a good life. When you tell this story, a story of a person who made it, a story of a person who is able to say, I was able to come out from this basement, to come out from this captivity. Many of them did not. They were not able, and we also need to remember that. Many, many, many of them were just stripped of this opportunity. They were brutally killed. There is a way to engage in the story in multiple ways and multiple times, because you find it hard to watch over and over again a picture of a dead child. There is a limit to that. You can do it once, twice, then it's hard. You need to stay with the picture of a dead child and to have the picture of a dead child, but you also have to offer other stories, and these are the stories of people who survived and are able to tell their stories. I will go into that deeper later, but that's probably the main takes.
I'll go to Patricia now, specifically because, finishing was what you said. One of the first, before we started, there was like a preemptive kind of pilot project our colleagues did, Peter Pomerantsev and Bifu, and they were in fact looking into the coverage of the migration in Italy. I'll connect all those dots. And there were people who were saying, like, don't show me this picture of that kid droning. You are manipulating my emotions. And my lessons from that was that if you're covering the world, it's very easy just to say, I don't care. Don't push me to know more about these poor kids in Gaza. Don't push me to know more about the, war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Or you just think, this is a controversial topic, our audience don't care, let them stay where they are. But Patricia, you've been 3 times in Ukraine reporting, you've been to a lot of places, but I understand that in Brazil, editors are not very interested in that story. And it took an effort to make you come, to let your editor let you come to Ukraine, but something different has happened. Tell us.
Well, first of all, thank you, everyone. That's amazing to see this audience and privileged to be speaking next to people I admire so much. Yes, first I wanted to say that it's interesting how the polarization infects foreign reporting, foreign news reporting. In Brazil, when I first started writing stories about Ukraine, I got all this criticism from left-wing commentators saying, you know, you're a CIA operator, because there's this automatic identification that if you were writing about Ukraine, you must be right-wing. In Latin America and other countries where you have some left-wing leaders, some progressive leaders, there's still like this older generation of progressive leaders who identify Russia with the former Soviet Union with an anti-colonial power, which not necessarily is true in the Putin government, as we all know. So it was just kind of funny because we had been living, we as journalists, being accused by the right wing of being fake news and of being, you know, communist, whatever. And then all of a sudden, if you're reporting about foreign news, you're reporting about the Ukraine war, the mere fact that you're reporting about Ukraine makes you a right-wing person or a CIA agent. On top of that, there is some sort, and we all know, and this is so sad, people are still dying, the war is going on, and at some point you need to convince, you know, the editors that this is an issue that still needs to be reported about because they feel there's a fatigue by the public and you know, that people would not be interested in the story. So it takes a lot of convincing, especially being from a Latin American country, which is not in Europe, you know, directly under threat. And that's what's surprising. I mean, I had the privilege of going to Ukraine 3 times, going to all different places. And one of the stories we did about the drone pilots, like we spent some time with the drone pilots, like showing how they work, how they target, and who they are, and speaking about their personal lives, and, you know, watching how they're like drinking their energy drink and smoking their cigarettes, and then, you know, under threat of being bombed or hit by a drone. And this story was one of the most widely read, was like the highest number of views in the newspaper in years, which was, in a way, a good surprise. You know, people are not necessarily, there's no apathy. If you manage to get through the bubble, and show, you know, there's a person there fighting, who is this person? What is this person thinking? I mean, regardless of you think this is an issue of right-wing or left-wing or US or Russia, it does keep people interested. So I thought this was a good example, and it actually helped my cause to convince, you know, the editors, see, people want to read that, please send me again. So I think there is a way. If you try to, if we manage to, and it is a cliche, but if you manage to show people who's behind, whose life is it, people are living in the war in spite of the war, what is their life like, you know? What are their aspirations, their expectations? Who are these people who are, you know, suffering, who are fighting? I think that still manages to, I don't know.
Because yes, it takes kind of some breaking the ice, so the editor accepts that I send this story, I send this reporter there, and the story won't be controversial, and there is a chance this would be read, and if you do it, maybe you can continue. I'll go to Natalia in particular to speak about the role of the digital platforms, but I also thought, mentioning what you said, like when we had people from all over the world coming to Ukraine, also partially sometimes on our invitation, we mentioned that specifically those who were influencers, like from specific countries which are under the, I don't know, like Russian disinformation, Indonesia, Mexico, Uganda, and Mongolia, like people who were very big on Twitter, were in Kiev and in Ukraine. They were specifically attacked for mere fact they were there. With somebody with the, like who is very experienced, it's okay. But some younger reporters felt like, I came here, it's actually not popular. I feel in my country that everybody is writing me like, why did you go there? Why you don't go to Moscow, for instance. It's very specific. I've given a specific example, but I want you to tell more how we see and what we can do that those platforms don't amplify those controversy, while we also can bridge and reach out to some people through those platforms.
Yeah, I want to, is this working? Yeah. I want to reflect on something that Patricia said, and I promise it does link up with your question. So the best job I've ever had, other than the one I have now, was being Central Asia correspondent for the BBC. I then was based in lots of other places, but that was an amazing job because BBC still had enough money to have a bureau in Central Asia, but no one in London gave a shit about what was going on in Central Asia. So, didn't care. Editors didn't care. And that gave me the opportunity to basically tell whatever stories there were that I wanted to tell. It also taught me that two things that I think are relevant for everyone. One is that the best stories are always on the edges. They're always in the periphery. They always start there. And whether it's a periphery, ideological periphery, geographical periphery, the darkest corners of the internet, this is where we need to look for stories. And the second thing is that as a journalist dealing with an editor, I am a salesperson. It is on me to sell that story to my editor and then to sell it to my audience. It's not on my audience to be interested in Gaza, in Ukraine, in a faraway conflict. People lead busy, complicated lives. It's on me to make the story interesting enough and relatable enough for them to care. Since then, the world has changed completely. And we now live in a place where I am increasingly convinced that it is nearly impossible to do that digitally. There are great examples of digital storytelling, but as internet turns into a cesspit, we keep putting just drops of clean water into what is essentially a pile of shit. And so we as journalists need to continue looking for new ways of telling stories because the polarization, because it is possible, and this Perugia is an example, what we do with live events is an example, your town halls, we know that getting people into the same room makes all the difference. The platforms, the internet is not there was a time when it was a thing that was going to connect us all. Now, and this is not my metaphor, but the best metaphor I think for what social media is, as you walk, it's a building, and you walk into a building, and if you're a racist, go over there, and if you are a woman, go over here, and you go into this little tiny bubbles where you are told what you already believe, and they are becoming increasingly impossible to burst, and that's the tech, that's the big tech model, like that's the business model, that's how they make money. This is all going to get worse with AI because and I love the technology. I think technology is amazing, but what AI is clearly doing, it's pushing us further into our now individualized reality, right? It's not even, you're not even there with like others who might challenge you or think of you. You're now literally talking to yourself. And if you think about the design of the GPT, like the chatbots, the very design of a chatbot is kind of, it talks to you like it is a human, and it's getting better and better at it. So you forget that it's a machine. You know, we've looking into stories about, you know, people think it's a divine power, right? People sort of use it to as therapists, and this design is very intentional, and it's a problem for, you know, that means that polarization will get worse if we stay on digital platforms, because there are no signs that the business model itself is changing.
I'll ask first about these meetings, you know, like the physical meetings compared to like this mass audience we have, the reach out, because we do believe that, you know, with internet, everybody can read the story globally, theoretically, but we so appreciate 10 people in the room watching our documentary in some way. And I'm moving to Angelina, returning to the theme of the documenting war crime. One of the projects we do is, our organization co-founded the Reckoning Projects on the war crimes documentation. And I want to also tell you your tips as an editor, as a filmmaker, as somebody who works on those stories, how you think we can do those stories better for the audiences which want to deny or don't care. But I'll give also this example that still during our history research, we did experiment with the focus groups. So we understood that on the controversial story, when it was a narrator's voice, and when there was a voice of the person who's spoken about like experience to the audience disagree from the historic past, the people trusted the first voice, and the trust for the narrator voice didn't work. So in our documentaries, we never do narrator voice. We really never do. And it was a funny experience for me when we screen our documentaries in Colombia, and after a workshop, a person came to me and said like, oh, thank you for showing the real Ukrainian people, because, you know, I don't trust journalists. Journalists do this kind of bad job, and like I don't want to watch the world through the eyes of journalists. So I was very happy to see all those real people. I'm like, I won't tell who I am. Maybe he missed the point, but I think maybe you would also, you know, like that. It was all us in the titles, but what do you also learned as an editor? What is your take, how you think we can tell the story, that people accept those difficult stories on the war crimes and they just don't walk away?
I think as simple as it sounds, and it's not simple at all, is actually take an effort and take a moment and think, whom are you actually speaking today to? Whom are you talking to? I mean, we coming from places of war and suffering and tragedy, we tend to think that someone who is in front of you should like engage immediately, because he's coming probably from a better place and he should care immediately. But he or she should not. There is no like obligation like that. And over this several years that we've been working together, telling these stories in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, we really took a huge effort to think about what resonates in every country that we're going to. For example, in Argentina, I think I was telling it last year, but I think it should resonate again, because it's a really good example. In Argentina, for some reason, when we got to work with Argentina, we got to know that there is a specific war crime that resonates not only with Argentinian law enforcement, but also with Argentinian public, and it's electrocution, because this is what was practiced in Argentina for many years, and it's something that the Argentinian justice system learned to deal with. They literally have investigators, prosecutors who know what kind of crime electrocution is. Because I should tell you, it's quite specific. When a person who survived electrocution comes and tells his or her story, and there are certain marks on his or her body, an investigator listens to this person. He needs to understand it. He needs to understand, or she needs to understand how it works. I've been actually a witness and talking. I'm not going to uncover which country was that, but we were talking on a level of human rights activists. How should we explain to a group of European investigators what electrocution is about? They do not have doctors that can say, yes, this person was electrocuted. They do not have investigators who, used to work with that. And it somehow resonated with Argentina, and one of the cases that we were able to present from Ukraine of a person who was electrocuted by the Russians and survived this and was able to tell his story. I can go further with other countries and with other, let's say, topics that resonate with other countries, economic stories in Africa, the grain story and the story of Russian blockade of grain shipment to Africa. It really, Russia still manipulates very much with this topic, but it is still something that the African public, I'm not gonna, label all Africa as one African, there's no such thing as African public, but in some African countries where we worked, it really resonated with people. It wasn't like, from the scratch, we're coming and say, we are Ukrainians, there is a huge tragedy here, please engage with our stories. That doesn't work like that. It's probably it's simple, but it's not. And maybe I should also add quite quickly about other research that we do, that we did just recently. It was a research on Ukrainian democracy and how people during the war perceived democracy. What are the boundaries of democracy during full-scale invasion? You are probably aware that if a war comes to your country, there are a certain number of laws that are imposed. A martial law is quite a tough thing, I should tell you. In Ukraine...
When the war comes to your countries, I hope not. That's something you need to know. Yeah. It's my bit of like...
and understand about the countries that are in war already. Many of them, not only Ukraine. So we really wanted to understand how people feel the limit of the freedoms and democracy during full-scale invasion, and what wasn't a quantitative analysis was qualitative, so we did lots of in-depth interviews with the military, with the people who are not serving in the army, with the females, with the people who are living abroad, and different other groups. And if you read all those interviews, it's like, people have different opinions on different things. So some of the people believe that Ukraine should hold elections immediately because we didn't have elections because of the martial law for 5 years now. Other people think, other people say, are you crazy? What kind of, how can you hold elections during the war? It's just absolutely impossible. And they were also right. But what we were able to draw as a conclusion is that the opinions are shaped by life experiences. And all these groups had their own life experiences. It was just our job, the journalists' jobs, to make sure that these people also share at least some part of reality. That it's not only that they live in their reality as a Ukrainian diaspora abroad, or as a military, I wouldn't say community, because literally every Ukrainian family has someone serving or killed or getting drafted, as a closed community. There is at least something that all of these people and groups share. What is it? It's a good editorial question. What is it? And it's something that the newsrooms should be asking themselves.
Patricia, returning now and going to Brazil, beyond you're a great investigative reporter, you done incredible stories on the father Bolsonaro, you sued Juan Bolsonaro's son and won the case for defamation, what I understand, and against you. But now there are chances that this family would return to power, and Folha de São Paulo really trying to be somehow in the middle. It's considered to be a bit left, but it's also like trying to give a platform for the right, more conservative views. So what is the discussion? And like, do you investigate, how to do anti-corruption investigation? Investigations to the audience which fully deny, and it's okay that my guy is corrupted because he's my guy. Is it like how you deal with that? And where is the discussion about, in the theme we are speaking, it's very easy to like normalize anti-democratic trend by giving a platform for a right-wing guy. You're kind of saying like, I'm not just speaking to my bubble. I want to give the floor to this dictator. what is the discussion and how you do think, where is this bargaining between, trying to reach out that audiences, how hard it is, maybe it's easy, and whether you're normalizing something by giving the platform?
Complicated question.
Everybody.
I think, well, I work for Folha de São Paulo. It's the leading newspaper in Brazil, but I think that's an issue of all the mainstream newspapers now. In the case of Folha, they usually do research to understand who is the audience of the newspaper and who are the columnists and what's the political views of the reporters. And one of the conclusions they reached was, for instance, that there were not enough, if you think about Brazilian society, almost half the population has somehow conservative views. That's why the current polling in Brazil is pretty much tied between current President Lula and Bolsonaro's son, Flávio, who is running for president. They are basically tied, and in some of the polling, Flávio Bolsonaro is ahead. So you have to understand that some of the part of the population does have conservative views. And so they were trying to reflect better and to reach out to these audiences too. So they hired more conservative columnists. I think this was like mainly this. And the discussion of giving platform, for instance, the newspaper published an article by former President Bolsonaro, and this was topic of huge controversy, should you give platform or not? And now I'm speaking on a strictly personal capacity here. I think if you give platform, you can't give like an unrestricted platform. You have to be able to question if the person who had anti-democratic attitudes, not only views, I mean, he did try to organize a coup d'etat. You have to be able to question, so not just give a mic, right? Have someone saying, this, what you're saying is not correct. This is not true. I do think that it's actually arrogant of us thinking, okay, I'm not going to give a platform because of his anti-democratic. He's going to have a platform. The newspapers are no longer, dictating the news cycle. The rest of the internet is. But if you are going to give a platform, the legitimacy of professional journalism outlet, you have to be able to question and to dispute false claims. You can't just give the microphone and open it for, freely. But I do think that you have to give a platform because it's not going to eliminate, almost half the population supports this view. What you can do is not like, okay, so I'm going to pretend this doesn't exist and I'm not going to give any space to this view or to this guy. No, the guy exists. So you might as well cover him properly and dispute whenever he's saying stuff that is not true. But that's my personal opinion, and I really need my job, so this is really personal.
But we want you to be at that job because we want that not just those guys who are hired are writing their columns.
Please. To be good at your job.
And Natalia, then I have this question about, again, the bargain, about going mainstream and going, nuanced, niche, but not marginal. Because at the same time, you can work for BBC and you have a large platform, but you, for instance, chose to do a very good publication, Coda, which do these long stories, which definitely reach less people than BBC, but there is a reason for that. Also, you'll do the festival, which would be amazing, but you bring as many as people, sometimes more, at the room where there would be incredible discussion. But you coming from the very mainstream media, my question is the same. I used to work for the news, I was running the news, foreign news in the biggest channel at the times where 40% of the people with TV watched that news report. And now I'm happy if there would be 10 people in the room in our town hall and they met each other. And how do you also think we measure this impact? And how do you balance? What are the choices?
I had an interesting conversation about journalism impact yesterday with someone. and you know, we have grown to understand impact as, you know, you write something and it changes the law, or it, you know, it gets someone fired, and that is amazing and wonderful, and that kind of investigative journalism is really, really, really important. But it's equally important to do journalism that, for journalism to exist in other forms, that, you know, doing it just for impact, I don't think is enough. And because if it doesn't exist, then it creates a vacuum, and the vacuum is always filled by someone else. But I think, sorry, I completely went off the question. The question is about...
Oh, it's about Coda. How do you mean?
Oh, yeah.
And Zeg in some way.
And the reason I left the BBC and started Coda was because it felt that I was increasingly just broadcasting as social media was taking off and the budgets were shrinking. I started questioning the value of what I was doing, because what got me into journalism is the kind of journalism journalism helped me when I was, you know, growing up in what was the Soviet Union and then very chaotic 90s. I saw how journalism helps people navigate their lives, how it can help people kind of give people understanding. And for me, that is also the really, really important impact of journalism, which is much harder to measure. But if it's not there, then, you know, it's the society changes. So for me, Coda was a way of, what I wanted to figure out was, how do you practice journalism in a way that creates continuity and context, because people understand their lives in context, and the news industry tends to present them as kind of this individual, like, pieces of information, right? And, you know, Coda uses its own methodology and a very different kind of process to follow stories over longer periods of time.
Yes, I wanted to add that there is some another important dilemma, which should we consciously approach as a dilemma, editorial dilemma. So the most people in this room probably are journalists and editors, and we are very much aware that in order to make things change, you need to kind of get the degree up of the problem, like tell that this is the main problem in the country right now, over and over and over again. And then in a good country, in a country with working institutions, you might have a solution, a resignation, a trial, whatever. But when you do that, I mean, this is why it's a dilemma. When you do that, you watch the media, there is an impression that there is only this problem existing in this country. I'm talking about the latest corruption cases in Ukraine, which actually led to some probably most high-level resignations in the country, just because the national media first were brave enough and were able to consciously uncover this corruption and talk about it on a very high degree. So, like, each day you would open up, you know, Ukrainian media outlets, and it's only about this corruption. It is called the Midas case. I wouldn't go into details, but basically it's about corruption in energy sector during war, which is absolutely outrageous to the majority of Ukrainians. And by the way, the social surveys and polls also showed that the Ukrainians also believed that it was like the most outrageous thing, and supported the fact that this case was uncovered. But then you read it, and you think, again, like nothing else is happening except for this one case. I don't have an answer how to approach it, but again, it's about it's about somehow balancing the whole picture of the day, the whole picture of you know what is challenging.
I think it's also about targeting the, you know, really knowing your audience as well, and for the impact, for that story to have the impact, it needed the public outrage and.
Of course, otherwise there wouldn't be any resignation, of course.
I want to leave some time for the questions, but I want Natalia briefly to say, and probably everybody a bit, but start with Natalia on Georgia. But when we know that something is genuine in the polarization, people have different opinions. Yes, they have different opinions, that's okay. Or you need to raise the tone because it's outrageous. But then you also know that like the malign actors are pushing into this polarization. They want to create the situation, it's as if the country on the civil war. How you deal with that, for instance, like in Georgia, you know, where you do have a protest every day, but at the same time you kind of feel as if like there are the people who hate the journalists, who attack the journalists, and probably it will go the same to, you know, Brazil. You also know about the cases how Russia do the campaigns to, like, really, it's not that people are polarized regarding some of the issues, draft, the energy, but you know that there are genuine campaigns.
I mean, I think the world that we live in is basically the dictators teamed up with the Silicon Valley, and both are doing the same thing. You know, both are sort of pushing. Silicon Valley created the big platforms created a system that works really, really well for authoritarian leaders who have always existed, and that marriage of the platforms and authoritarians is the result of, you know, is the reason why we are witnessing the tide, this authoritarian tide around the world, with some, you know, exceptions that obviously things can change, and Hungary is a great example. But Georgia is one of many places that is very, very polarized on same issues that are polarizing societies all around the world. It's vaccines, it's gay rights, it's family values, it's history. And the reason why the polarization is so bad is, you know, because the communication happens primarily through digital platforms and not through some sort of sense of shared reality.
I think Patricia, so what do you do when, you know, like that you go into the elections this year, and it would be fierce.
Yes, I just wanted to mention something that Natalia said about the marriage between big tech and authoritarian leaders. It is so unprecedented. I mean, we cannot overlook this. Last year, President Trump initiated an investigation of the United States Trade Representative, and is threatening to sanction Brazil because Brazil dared to regulate big tech. They are trying to prevent Brazil from regulating big tech. So this is, I mean, there's no normalizing of this on top of trying to interfere with the elections. And so this is so intertwined, you know, this power of both, you know, authoritarian leaders and big tech. But I know you have to go to the question.
A small note, I think like a question on impact of smaller, for example, investigative projects or independent media. I think it's exactly what we should need to think about, not the numbers, but impact. Exactly these investigations and these newsrooms are capable of making corrupt officials resign, are capable of making justice system work. And we understand that, you know, the impact and the numbers are incomparable. You would have, for example, a national media having millions of views, I don't know, of a video with something, but then you would have a story from a smaller independent media that tackles one problem and it gets solved, and because of the
that's
impact,
actually
not the
really
numbers.
important to the point that you made about, you know, the BBC was a giant audience. Now we have a much smaller audience. But I think it's really, you know, it's about what kind of, like, if you're telling the story to the right person, if you're reaching the right person, you don't need the mass reach with a lot of the journalists.
Maybe we have one question if we have a time. So please do, if it's possible. Yeah, I know that we are hard on time. Oh yeah, upstairs. No, yeah, right, Ken. Please.
Hi, thanks. I'll be brief. My name's Jen Stout. That was a great panel. Natalia, I'm going to ask you something, and maybe I sound so naive and optimistic and rosy, but when you're talking about, I think it's a great analogy, this building where you're funneled into certain places as social media or online world, and it also being just a cesspit of shit. I love print. And I know that newspapers aren't going to come back, but I really, really believe, and I hope, that maybe the way to get through bubbles is kind of old-fashioned, long-reported features, beautifully written, well-crafted, well-fact-checked, in physical things that people can read that are an escape from the bubble. Am I being very overly optimistic here?
Probably, both yes and no. I think there is definitely a bit of a trend going towards print publications. There is definitely a huge trend of events. We definitely are hungry for tangible objects that get us off the world that we live in online. I don't think mass print will come back. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? It's unpredictable, but I think it's really, really important. I think the format is not as important as most of us tend to think. I think it's incredibly important to keep reinventing new formats and think of journalism as a practice. And speaking of polarization, I mean, we've talked about it the other day. I really think that no other profession is better suited for the world we live in, because what journalists are, we're really great translators. We can translate between different realities. And as the society goes deeper and deeper into these different realities, we can be, as a BBC correspondent, I was told that somebody's terrorist is somebody else's freedom fighter. Like, that is the most important thing to remember today, as we cannot agree on anything, and then we need to figure out ways of how to practice journalism in new formats as well, because I don't think there will be a massive comeback of print, but there will be some, and we have a responsibility. We need to figure out how we can use AI to do what we do, which is, obviously investigate and report, but also translate realities for people and keep them somehow connected. I think it is on us to really do whatever we can to preserve shared reality.
And we would round it up. I really think I also would make this summary that I think the only way is really reality, and find the other ways to put a bit weight to your journalist. It was easy just to do news. It was easier. Now we need to do...
But now AI can do the news.
Yeah. No.
We do the reporting.
Yes, I think it's as well, because in the end, for the work we do, just proving the war crimes, we need to collect 600 testimonies of the war crime survivors, analyze them, do it in a nuanced way, and then I feel the legitimacy to say, like, no, it's not my opinion. We needed to have a town hall. It's not my emotion. We brought together 120 Ukrainians who discussed this topic, and I saw them with my lives, and there were 120. And when we speak about the democracy and the perception of the elections, yes, it costs some money, to do the focus group, but we can say that's what Ukrainian thinks about the elections. At least it's not just my opinion. So I probably encourage everybody to think about ways which fits you, suits your newsroom, suits your publication, to a bit return to this reality. And that would be, still for me, probably of our experience, the biggest impact I feel when we gathered these survivors from the small southern Ukrainian city. The man has been executed during the Russian occupation, and but the lady never believed in justice. She has never reason to believe good into the Ukrainian prosecutors. His wife, his widow, and she left the meeting with the one word saying, "I see these people are not our enemies. Our enemies is elsewhere." That was enough for me. So in any case, thank you so much for following the work of everybody, and thank you for the discussion. I thought we will do that, not mentioning Trump once, but Patricia, you did it. Thank you.